Let's get
psycho,
logical,
psycho,
logical.
Hey, what's up, learning fans? Oh, that song never gets old. Now available on iTunes and Amazon or wherever you buy music. Today's video is meant to introduce you to the concepts of generalization and discrimination in learning. And this is all about determining, in a given situation, how do we know which stimuli come to control behavior? So picture, if you will, an experiment in which, let's use pigeons. We're going to take pigeons and we're going to present them with a stimulus that is a little key, and it's a round circular key, and the key is red, but we're going to project onto the key a white triangle. Right? So picture a red key with a white triangle. So a red circle with a white triangle inside it. And we're going to train the pigeon to peck that little key. And this is based on an actual experiment. And what we're going to do is we're going to train the pigeon on this for a while. They're going to be learning to peck the key for food. And then we're going to give them a test. And we're going to separate the two elements of our stimulus that we've trained. We're going to take the circle and put it on one side, the red circle. And we're going to take the white triangle and put it on the other side. And then we're going to ask the pigeon to choose between the two options. So the question is, which of those two, if any, was the pigeon learning to respond to? Well, if you do this experiment, what happens is you find out that the pigeon, it just depends on which pigeon you're testing. Some pigeons peck the circle, some pigeons peck the triangle. And so some of them were learning about the circle, some were learning about the triangle. And so figuring out which stimulus is going to control behavior in a given situation is an interesting problem. Now, being able to teach an animal to respond to one stimulus or another, that's what we call discrimination. So when, in the case of this pigeon who's pecking either the circle or the triangle, preferentially, I would call that discrimination learning because they have two different responses to two or more stimuli. Now, discrimination training is really useful for all kinds of problems. It's a nice tool in the toolbox of someone who's studying learning or comparative psychology or wants to understand the sensory capabilities of a nonverbal individual like an animal or a baby. Because you can essentially ask questions to say, hey, can you tell the difference between these two things? So discrimination learning is used for all kinds of stuff. It's used to help us understand what kind of color vision different animals have. It helps us understand the number abilities of different animals. It helps us understand all kinds of different cognitive capacities. Now, what about the opposite of discrimination training? What about a situation in which you respond the same to two similar but different stimuli? Well, we have a word for that too, and that is generalization. So generalization is when you have the same response to different stimuli. And when we study this, typically what we do is we train the animal or individual to respond to a specific stimulus, and then we test how they respond when we give them a variety of stimuli. Now, the resulting data that we get, usually it's in a graph form, is something we call a generalization gradient. Right? In other words, gradients change over time. And Generalization, that's change across stimuli. Right? So generalization, a gradient, just tells you how the behavior changes across stimuli. So as an example, I have this little squeeze box, and I'm going to pretend that this is the tone that I want to train. Right? So imagine that that tone was paired with something useful like food. Now the question is, what would happen if I changed that tone slightly? Would the individual still, who was learned with this tone, still respond to this tone? Right? Maybe they would respond to it, but respond maybe a little bit less. What about if I went even more further away? By the time I get up there, that's pretty different from. So maybe they won't respond to this very much at all. On the other hand, what if I went the other way? So I could go down, and you can imagine as I got closer and closer, there'd be almost no responding here. A little bit more, a little bit more. There we go. Now we're going to get a lot of responding because that's the stimulus we trained. A little bit less, even less, and almost no responding. So even though this is the one we trained, to tones that were similar to that stimulus that we trained, we get a lot of responding, but it falls off as we get farther and farther away from that stimulus. Right? That's not uncommon to see. Okay, so that's what we would call a generalization gradient. And there's all kinds of questions that come up when you start looking at generalization gradients about what determines how steep a generalization gradient is. In other words, how quickly do the responses fall off as you move away from that specific value that you've trained. And this is usually done with tones or with lights, with colored lights. So tones might be just like what you heard, or with lights, they run the spectrum of the visual light spectrum. So you might train a yellow light and then test an orange light, a red light, and so on. Now, one kind of experiment that we can do is called discrimination training. That's where usually we have, instead of just one stimulus, in that example, I trained one stimulus, right? So I had that specific tone that indicated that a reward was going to be delivered, and then I tested several others. Well, there's a procedure called discrimination training, which is where you present two stimuli. One that's rewarded, usually we call that stimulus A, and because it's rewarded, it's A plus. And the second stimulus we call B, and since it's not rewarded, we call it B minus. And so you can use the discrimination training procedure to ask these kinds of questions about, can you tell the difference between A and B? And the animal, usually, if they can do it, they will learn to respond to A, but not to B. Okay. So there are a number of questions that come up, and one is illustrated by a procedure known as overshadowing. And in the overshadowing design, what they do is they start by training a complex or a compound stimulus. So you take A and B and you pair them together. Now what you do is you pair them together, but one of them you make more intense than the other. So they're both equally contingent. The reward is equally contingent on both of them. But for one of the stimuli, the salience is increased. So the design of this experiment goes like this. In the first phase, A and B are paired together, but you can picture like a little bitty A and a great big B. Now you move into a test phase and you say, how much did they learn about A? Now we need a control group in this case, and so what the control group is one that received training in, while the first group was getting A with big B, they were just getting A by itself, lowercase a, so the weak stimulus. So A is equated across both groups. Now we test how much did they learn about A. Well, in this control group, they learn fairly well. There's no problems. But what about in the overshadowing group, the one where they had this B that was so salient at the same time that A was there? Well, in that case, when you look at how they respond to A in a future test, then you get a decrement. We call it generalization decrement. In other words, the amount of responding they make to A goes down. So anyway, this is the idea of overshadowing. Some things that are more salient, more attention-getting, are going to be better at controlling, grabbing control of the behavior. Now, another thing that is useful to know about when we talk about generalization and discrimination is that the type of reinforcement matters as well. So picture this experiment. This was Fori and Lolordo, 1973. And they were looking at working with pigeons. And the task was the pigeons had to press a little treadle, a little foot pedal on the floor of the training box. And there was a discriminative stimulus, right? That's in our instrumental conditioning terms when we have S, R, O, right? The S is the discriminative stimulus. The R is pressing the treadle. And then we had two outcomes. One outcome was shock avoidance, so that's one group. And another group is going to get food. So in the first group, the shock avoidance group, we're going to have the discriminative stimuli come on, and then the animal has to make a response on the treadle. And if it makes the response, then it doesn't get shocked. If it fails to make a response, then it does get shocked. In the other group, the food group, the light comes on, they press the treadle while the light is on, and then they get the food. Now, the stimulus that they used was a compound stimulus, and it consisted of a tone and a light presented together. Now, when then later, they tested to see whether the light was better at controlling behavior or was the tone better at controlling behavior. Well, it turns out if they were trained with the food, then the pigeons tended to respond to the tone, but not the light. However, if they were trained with shock, then they tended to respond to the light and not the tone. So this is all suggesting that for whatever reason, and we don't really know what the reason is, probably something to do with the evolutionary history of the animals that predisposes them to this kind of discrimination. They tended to be more likely to associate the tone part of the stimulus with food and the light with pain. Another question that we could ask about generalization and discrimination is what exactly is going on here. And Pavlov initially noticed generalization when he started noticing other sounds that were able to elicit responses from his dogs that weren't the specific thing that was actually trained. And he said, his idea was that, well, because these things are similar to the stimulus that was trained, there's a transfer of some of the association with the thing that you trained to things that are similar to what you trained. Right? So if I walk by a blue gumball machine one day and I find a quarter out of it, that somebody's left in there, next time I walk by a similar kind of machine, I might look for a quarter there too. Or but the more eventually you get something that's very different kind of machine, maybe I won't look in there. So maybe if I walk by a Coke machine, I'll be less inclined to look in there. But every gumball machine I walk by, since it's similar to that first gumball machine, maybe I'll look for the quarter. Another approach to this was actually proposed by by Lashley and Wade, and they said, well, maybe it's not about a transfer of the learning to other stimuli. Maybe it's it has to do with the absence of learning. In other words, the animal has learned to respond to an auditory sound, let's say, but it hasn't learned that it's supposed to not respond to some sounds, but it is supposed to respond to others. And so their emphasis was really on the learning history of the animal. Personally, I don't like that explanation as much because it seems to me like that if that were true, then the animal would be responding to all kinds of stimuli. I don't see how that would give you a generalization, a gradient. But the emphasis there is on the learning experiences rather than the physical properties of the stimuli tested. Now, here's an interesting question. Let's say we trained we went through the discrimination training, and we adapted my procedure from earlier where we're training this. So that's going to be A, and that's going to generate a generalization gradient just like it did the first time. And so we're probably going to get a lot of responding to this and a little bit less to this and almost none to this and then nothing here. Okay? What happens if I start training and the same thing's going to happen the other way up the scale? What do you think would happen, though, if I trained this to be the target and then something just a little bit above it? There was no, I trained to be B minus where there was no reward. So reward, no reward. What do you think would happen to that generalization gradient? Would it get narrower? Maybe it would just get narrower on one side. So keep in mind, now I'm teaching the animal, respond to this, but not to this. Okay, so if you do that experiment, and then you look at how the generalization gradient changes, what you find is that, sure enough, on the side that you've trained, or that you train the discrimination on, it gets narrower, right? They stop responding to, they would keep responding to this, and then they stop responding to this. So you get a very sharp peak when you go. So you get nothing, 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 nothing. Now you get all the responding. But what happens on the other side of the scale? Because you haven't discriminated on the other side of the scale, what happens there? Well, it turns out that when you go down one, where you would have gotten a lot of responding before, now you don't get responding because of the discrimination training. It's interesting because it means that discrimination training on one side of the gradient impacts the steepness of the gradient on the other side. It works symmetrically. And that's kind of interesting. One more thing I'll mention about this is that you can actually, it doesn't have to be external cues that drive this phenomenon. In fact, you can get discrimination using interoceptive cues. So an interoceptive cue is an internal cue. So there are all kinds of internal cues in your body. There are things like how hungry you are. You have a chronometer that estimates how much time has passed. You have the ability to estimate distance traveled. You have a built-in odometer. So you have all kinds of interoceptive cues that tell you about things. So you have proprioception, which allows you to kind of estimate where you are in space. So if you block your visual stimuli, close your eyes, whatever you want to do, and then you turn around the room, you can turn around the room 3 times and then point towards the door, you're probably going to be pretty accurate. Another type of interoceptive cue that we can leverage is something like internal states, such as when you're under the influence of a drug. And the book describes an experiment in which they train an animal to respond while under the influence of a drug, and then they don't reinforce it when they're not under the influence of the drug. And then you can give them various doses of the drug and see how they respond. And it turns out you will get, after the discrimination training, you will get a nice steep discrimination curve. So in discrimination training, what exactly is being learned here? One idea, and this was put forth by Kenneth Spence in the 1930s, is that not only are you learning to respond to the stimulus that is reinforced, right? That's not surprising, because that happens even without discrimination training. If you reinforce something, they tend to learn about it. But according to Spence, there's also, for the one that's not reinforced, you acquire, you get inhibition, response inhibition. So when that when that stimulus is available, it suppresses responding. And so it's not altogether clear why that would be the case, just on the surface, because you don't necessarily need that to be learned. But you can do an experiment in which you test for this. So how do you do it? Well, what you do is you do what we call a summation test. And in a summation test, what you're going to do is you're going to first start with your discrimination, A plus, B minus. And you're going to do this discrimination, and once the animal's well trained in discriminating between A plus and B minus quite well, now you're going to throw them a curveball. You're going to present A plus and B minus together at the same time and see how much they respond. Now, if there's no inhibition from B minus, then they'll respond to A plus. They won't do anything to B minus, and so you'll get really vigorous responding as though the B minus wasn't even there. On the other hand, if B minus does have inhibition associated with it, then what will happen is when you present AB minus, A plus B minus, when you present them together, you will get a reduction in the amount of responding. In other words, you will inhibit some of the responding. So you should get less responding to AB than you would to A by itself. And it turns out if you do that experiment, that's exactly what you find. You get some inhibition to associated when you present the B minus. So I want to make this even more complicated. So let's say we have our A plus and B minus. That seems easy enough to learn to discriminate. So what if we made it, because you're learning to get excitatory conditioning when you see A and inhibitory when you see B. Can we go a step further than that? And this is what we call positive and negative patterning. So what you do in positive and negative patterning is you train the animal. Let's start with positive patterning. In positive patterning, we're going to train the animal that A by itself doesn't mean anything. B by itself doesn't mean anything. But when they see A and B together, that's when they're going to get a reward. Okay? So picture an animal seeing a light and sometimes hearing a tone. And whenever those things happen, it can respond, but it's not going to get any rewards. But if the light and tone happen together, then they're going to get a reward. And it turns out animals can learn to do this quite well. And think about what that requires. You're not just learning about A, because A is sometimes rewarded and sometimes not. You're not just learning about B, because sometimes B is rewarded and sometimes not. You have to learn about the relationship of A and B occurring together versus them occurring separately. So that's what we call positive patterning. Negative patterning is sort of the opposite. It's where A by itself, well, let's choose a different set of letters. So let's say C by itself gets you a reward. D by itself gets you a reward. But C and D together get you nothing. Right? And the reason why I wanted to do a separate set of letters is because now you can picture an experiment where we did all these things at once. We have A, which is not rewarded, B, which is not rewarded, but when A and B are together, they are rewarded. C is rewarded, D is rewarded, but C and D together is not rewarded. So now you've got both positive and negative patterning in the same experiment. And rats can do this just fine. Trying to think of good examples in life. The only thing that's coming to mind is I had an old friend who tried to date two people at once, and you can think of each one a date with each one individually is rewarding, right? So this is like negative patterning. As long as C is by itself or D is by herself, then everything's good. But C and D together, that's definitely inhibitory. That does not go well. One more phenomenon we haven't talked about yet is something called the peak shift idea. And the peak shift effect is basically what happens when you do discrimination training and you get the discrimination between the target that you've trained, the S plus, and the S minus, so that would be B minus, as we've been talking about it. When those two are very close together, sometimes what happens is, rather than just tightening up the distribution of responses, it might be the case that the whole distribution shifts a little bit. In other words, if you look at a normal group that just gets that doesn't get discrimination training. They're just trained with some S plus, right? So they're trained to a target. You get and you look at a graph, the peak of that is right on the target that they trained, and then the responses sort of fall away as you get further and further and further away from the target that you trained. Well, now imagine that you test a stimulus that's really close to the target and you train them to discriminate that from the original target. Now what happens is, it's almost like the whole peak, in order to not make a mistake and respond accidentally to the thing, to the S minus, the whole peak shifts, and actually the peak of the target, the peak responding doesn't happen at the original target. It actually happens at a little bit different area. So this idea of peak shift has also been implicated in art and aesthetics. And so let me give you an example. So let's say you're training pigeons to discriminate between rectangles. So rectangle, you have a slightly rectangular rectangle compared to a square. So when you present the rectangle, the bird gets a reward. When you present the square, the bird gets no reward. So you're training the bird to recognize the rectangle and not the square. Now you give them a rectangle that's really rectangular, and you see what they do. Well, in this case, the bird goes, "Wow, that's a sexy rectangle," and starts pecking away, right? So you can think of this as kind of like a supernormal stimulus. You're essentially training what's a normal stimulus and then what's a supernormal stimulus, if you remember our discussions of supernormal stimuli a long time ago. And so that's the peak shift idea, is that by training through that discrimination training, you might actually build a preference, not for the target, but for something that's slightly in the other opposite direction of the S minus. All right, so we've been talking about discrimination training and how you can train the animal to distinguish between different types of stimuli. Could you also train generalization? And so this is a series of procedures that seek to establish what we call stimulus equivalence. And so the idea behind stimulus equivalence is you want to treat two stimuli to have the same outcome and then see whether or not the two stimuli are then treated the same. So the design of this experiment is usually, it can get kind of complicated, but I'm going to give you a simplified version just so you can follow along. Imagine that we have four stimuli, A, B, C, and D. We're also going to have four different responses, R1, R2, R3, and R4. In the first phase, we're going to train A and B with response 1 and C and D with response 2. The idea is that during this phase, A and B have the same require the same response to get the same outcome. And C and D require the same response to get the same outcome. So therefore, these two should be roughly equivalent. A and B should be equivalent to each other, and C and D should be equivalent to each other. But A and B are different from C and D. Now in the next phase, we're going to take A and C, and now we're going to pair those with new responses. So remember, in the first phase, A and B were both paired with response 1, and they got food. In the next phase, A is going to be associated with response 3. Whereas in phase 1, C and D were associated with response 2 and food. Now C is going to be associated with response 4. So you see what we've done? First, we trained pairs of stimuli to two different responses. Now we're taking one member of the pair and training it to a new response. Now we can ask a question. So now we move on to our test phase. And in the test phase, we present B and give them a chance to respond on R3, response 3. And we give them D, right, which should be equivalent to C. And we give them the chance to respond on R4, which has been associated with C. So B has never been paired with response 3, but B is equivalent to A, and A has been paired with response 3. So we want to see if that equivalence transfers over. And using this kind of design, we can find evidence that animals can learn that two things are more or less equivalent. And this is sort of like learning a rule or a category, sort of like a category learning. Instead of learning about a specific fish, you're learning that if it's sort of like a fish, then you should make this response. So the answer seems to be yes, we can train some forms of generalization as well as discrimination. So generalization and discrimination learning are important for all kinds of different tasks. While any kind of expertise usually requires some form of discrimination, right? Being an expert musician requires you to discriminate well between pitches and different timbres and different kinds of things like that. If you are an expert figure skater, you're going to learn to distinguish between what looks like a good triple Lutz and a bad triple Lutz when they all look the same to me. If you are a chicken sexer, which, by the way, that's a real job, it's a really important job. The chicken industry has almost no use for male chickens, so they only want female chickens, and so you don't want to feed a chicken any longer than you have to. And so the way they handle this is when they are breeding baby chicks, they want to, as early as possible after hatching, be able to distinguish between male and female chicks. There are a couple of methods to do this, and but it really takes a lot of training and expertise to be able to distinguish between a male and a female bird, and to be able to do this very quickly is a highly sought after skill, and to do it accurately. So that requires some definite discrimination learning. So a number of fields require these kinds of things. Anyway, that's what I have for you guys on discrimination and generalization. And I was very tempted to give you guys a little more than that, but I think that's a pretty good overview for now. All right, I'll see you next time. Happy learning.